People in the village started whispering. They remembered the lawsuit. Lorenz had been in a relationship with Victoria. He claimed her son, little Joseph, was his. Then he took it back. Then he sued for custody. It was a mess of blood and pride. Did he kill them to clear the slate, to take what he thought was his? Police questioned him for hours. They looked at his hands. They looked at his shoes. But they couldn't prove it. Lorenz lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. He even sued people for calling him a murderer. But every time he walked through the village, the talking would stop. He was a man living in a prison made of his neighbors' glares. But then, there's the ghost of Carl Gabriel. The distant sound of a World War I whistle, the rattle of a machine gun fading into the wind. Carl was Victoria's husband. He supposedly died in the trenches of France in 1914, but his body was never recovered. In the aftermath of the war, thousands of dead soldiers turned out to be alive, shell-shocked, missing, or just looking for a way to disappear. Think about the motive. Carl comes home from the hell of the war. He's scarred. He's different. He walks up to his old farm and sees another man, Lorenz, claiming his wife and fathering a child in his bed. The rage, the cold, soldier's precision. Some of his old trenchmates later claimed that Carl hadn't died. They said they saw him. They said he was the man who wouldn't speak. If it was Carl, it explains the dog. The Spitz dog didn't bark because it recognized its master's voice, even after 8 years. It explains why the killer stayed for 4 days. He wasn't a stranger. He was coming home. The sound of a heavy metal door closing with an echo. But we will never know because of the skulls. This is the part that sounds like a fever dream. The police, desperate for a lead, sent the decapitated skulls of the Grubers to Munich. They gave them to a clairvoyant, a woman who claimed she could see the last moments of a person's life by touching their remains. Imagine this woman in a dark room in Munich, holding the shattered skull of 7-year-old Cecilia. She claimed she saw a shadow with no face. She saw a man who felt justified. It was useless. And then the skulls vanished. During the Allied bombings of Munich in the 1940s, the police archives were hit. The boxes containing the Hinterkaifeck remains were either destroyed or stolen. When the families tried to rebury the victims properly, they had to bury them headless. Today, if you go to that spot in Bavaria, you won't find a farm. You'll find a wide open field. There's a small stone memorial there. It's quiet. But local farmers will tell you that the soil there is different. Nothing grows quite right on the footprint of the barn. And when the fog rolls in from the forest, that same dark forest where the footprints started, you can still feel the weight of 1,000 eyes. The sound of footsteps on gravel getting closer, then stopping abruptly. The case of Hinterkaifeck was officially closed in the 1950s, but in 2007, a group of students at the police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck used modern forensic tools to look at it one last time. They used DNA technology, psychological profiling, and computer modeling. They came to a conclusion. They found a suspect. They said the evidence was overwhelming, but they refused to release the name. Why? Because the suspect's descendants are still alive. They are still living in the villages around the farm. The police decided that the truth would destroy the families that are left. So, the killer's name is locked in a vault. He won. He stayed in the house. He ate their food. He slept in their beds. And 100 years later, his family still walks the same streets as the people who wonder what happened that night. Next time you're in an old house and you hear a thud in the attic, or you find a window open that you know you closed, don't just assume it's the wind, because someone might just be waiting for you to fall asleep so they can start their shift as the master of the house. The rhythmic ticking of a clock, then it stops. The autopsy was conducted on the kitchen table. Imagine that. The same table where they had eaten their soup became a butcher's block. The most chilling discovery was about the 7-year-old girl, Cecilia. She didn't die instantly. She lay in the hay, in the dark, surrounded by her dead family for nearly 3 hours. She had pulled out clumps of her own hair by the roots. The police found the hair clutched in her tiny, frozen fist. She had been terrified to death before the wound finally took her. But the mystery doesn't end with the bodies. The police were so desperate for answers that they did something insane. They decapitated the bodies. They sent the skulls of the 6 victims to Munich. Why? Because they wanted to give them to clairvoyants. They believed that a psychic could read the last memories of the dead by holding their skulls. But the skulls never came back. During the chaos of World War II, the skulls of the Hinterkaifeck victims vanished from the archives. To this day, no one knows where they are. The family was buried without their heads. Who was the killer? Was it Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who found the bodies and seemed too calm during the search? He knew the layout of the house. He had a key. And some say he wanted to claim his son back from the Grubers. Or was it Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was reported killed in the trenches of World War I? Many soldiers believe he didn't die. They say he went AWOL, came back to find his wife with another man's child, and waited in the attic for his revenge. But there's one piece of evidence that ruins every theory. The dog. The farm dog, a Spitz, was found in the barn. He had been hit once, but he was alive. He was tied up. The dog knew the killer, because if a stranger had spent a week in the attic, the dog would have barked the house down. The dog stayed silent, which means the 6th man wasn't a stranger. He was someone the dog loved. Who could walk into a house, be greeted by the dog, sleep in the attic, and then methodically destroy an entire bloodline? A low, growling wind, the sound of a door locking from the inside. In the final chapter, we're going to look at the letter from the grave and why, even today, the Munich Police Academy still uses this case to train its detectives. We'll find out why the farm was burnt to the ground and what was found hidden beneath the floorboards of the nursery. Are you sure you're alone in your house right now? Because old Andreas Gruber thought he was too. They thought they could bury the secret by burning the farm to the ground. As the floorboards were ripped up, they found it. The weapon, stained with blood, hidden right above the beds where the victims once slept. And as the skulls of the family vanished into history, one question remained. What if the killer never actually left the village? Chapter 7, The Empty Field. The low, mournful lowing of a single cow in the distance, the sound of a cold wind whipping through an open, empty space. 1 year later, 1923, the Hinterkaifeck farm was no longer a home. It was a scar on the landscape. The locals avoided it. They said the wind didn't just blow through the trees there. It whispered. It whispered the names of the dead. It whispered the secrets of the attic. The community decided the only way to move on was to erase it. They brought the hammers. They brought the fire, the roar of a controlled fire, the crackling of old, dry timber. But as the workers tore into the structure, the house gave up one last, terrifying secret. Imagine a worker, covered in dust, prying up a heavy floorboard in the attic, right near the chimney, right above where the family used to sleep. His crowbar catches on something heavy, something metallic. He pulls it out, and the air in the room suddenly feels 10 degrees colder. It was the mattock, the L-shaped pickaxe. It was covered in dried, dark stains. It hadn't been thrown into the woods. It hadn't been buried in the fields. The killer had hidden it inside the house. He had tucked it away like a dark trophy, right under the feet of anyone who dared to enter. Why? Why keep the weapon so close? Maybe it was a final screw you to the police, or maybe the killer intended to come back for it. The narrator's voice becomes more intimate, more conversational. As the farm turned to ash, the investigation turned to the people left behind. And that's where the story of Hinterkaifeck goes, from a horror movie to a psychological thriller. Let's talk about Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was the neighbor who led the search party. He was the one who broke down the door. And he was the one who, according to witnesses, walked straight to the bodies in the dark and started touching them. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't disgusted. He was familiar. In the barn, just a few yards away, the bodies of the Gruber family are piled under a layer of hay, but the killer has chores to do. Real police records show that the cattle were fed every single day. The cows were milked. Someone even let the farm dog out to run in the yard. Why? Was it a lingering sense of farm life duty? Or was it a cold, calculated move to make sure the neighbors didn't get suspicious? If the cows started screaming from hunger, people would come knocking. And the killer wasn't ready to leave his new home just yet. The crackle of a fire. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. This is what we call frogging in modern true crime. Someone living inside your home without you knowing, like the case of Daniel LaPlante, who hid inside the walls of a family home for months, watching them sleep. But this was worse. This was a man living in a tomb. The neighbors, like Albert Hoffner, later reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney on Saturday and Sunday. They saw lights moving from room to room at night. They figured the Grubers were just busy with the new maid. But imagine the killer's internal monologue as he lay in Andreas's bed. Did he feel powerful? Did he listen to the wood settle and the mice scurry, knowing he was the only thing left alive in that house? There's a legendary mystery here. On Sunday, a local man named Hans Shirovsky walked onto the farm to deliver a message. He knocked. No one answered. He said the house felt hollow. He described a sense of being watched from the second-story windows, the same windows Andreas had checked with his mattock just nights before. The killer was right there, standing behind the glass, inches away, watching Hans walk away. Why didn't he kill Hans too? Maybe he was full. Maybe the play acting as the head of the house was more satisfying than another murder. By Monday, the mailman noticed that the newspapers were piling up on the porch. The 7-year-old Cecilia hadn't shown up for school. The tension in the nearby village of Wangen was starting to boil. People were talking. The Grubers are strange, they said, but they're not this quiet. On the morning of April 4th, the killer finally decided his vacation in hell was over. He didn't leave a mess. He washed the dishes he used. He made the bed. He packed his things, whatever those were, and stepped out of the house. He didn't leave any footprints this time. The snow had melted into mud. He simply vanished back into the woods, leaving behind a farm that was nothing but a silent, blood-stained shell. Chapter 6. The archive whispers. The sharp crack of a wooden door being kicked in. The sound of heavy boots walking on a hollow wooden floor. Tuesday, April 4th, 3:30 p.m. 3 neighbors, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, Michael Poe, and Jakob Sigel, couldn't take the silence anymore. They walked up to the farm, their hearts heavy with a dread they couldn't name. Lawrence led the way. He had a history with the family. He was the one rumored to be the father of the youngest child. He reached the barn door. It was heavy, made of thick oak, the screech of rusted hinges. The smell hit them first. It wasn't just the smell of a farm. It was the heavy metallic scent of old blood and the sweet, sickly rot of 4 days in a closed space. Lawrence stepped inside. The light was dim, filtered through the cracks in the roof. He saw the hay. It looked disturbed. He pulled at a corner of a blood-soaked blanket. And then he saw the feet. The scene was a pyramid of horror. 4 bodies stacked like cordwood. Old Cecilia, Victoria, Andreas, and little Cecilia. Their skulls had been shattered with such force that the doctors later said pieces of bone were driven deep into their brains. A sharp, shuddering breath. The narrator sounds shaken. But the investigation was just beginning, and it was going to get much, much weirder. The police from Munich arrived the next day. They were used to city crimes, bar fights, jealous husbands. They weren't prepared for Hinterkaifeck. They found the house in a state of eerie perfection. The kitchen was clean. The table was set for a meal that would never be eaten. But when they started looking for fingerprints, nothing. The killer had been there for 4 days. He had touched everything. The stove, the coffee pot, the doorknobs, the tools. But there wasn't a single smudge. It was as if a ghost had done the chores. And then there was the shadow. Investigators found a spot on the attic floor where the dust had been wiped away. Someone had been lying there, right above the master bedroom, for days before the murders. They found 2 nests in the hayloft where someone had slept. They even found 2 indentations in the roof tiles where someone had shifted the shingles to create a peephole to watch the yard. The killer hadn't just moved in after the murders. He had been a silent roommate for a week before he even picked up the matter. She stepped into the dark maw of the barn. "Andreas, is that you?" she called out. The answer was silence. And then, a lightning-fast move from the dark. The mattock hit her square in the skull. She fell onto the hay without even a whimper. Victoria followed. She was looking for her mother. She stepped into the barn, her eyes not yet used to the dark, and tripped over Cecilia's body. Victoria opened her mouth to scream, but a second blow crashed down on her from above. The killer hit like a pro, aiming for the top of the head. They fell on top of each other, forming a gruesome pyramid of flesh and homespun clothes. Andreas was third. The old man who took so much pride in his home walked in with a lantern. The lamplight briefly caught a figure in dirty clothes and steel raised high. The lantern slipped from his hands, the glass shattered, and the oil caught fire in a small, brief flame on the floor. In that light, Andreas saw the killer's eyes. There was no madness there, just emptiness. Sound, a heavy thud, the crunch of bone. The last to enter the barn was little Kazelia, the 7-year-old granddaughter. She was looking for her mom. She'd watched the shadows swallow the adults. She stood in the barn doorway, shivering. The killer didn't spare her. She lived for several hours after the blow. Experts would later find clumps of hair in her hands. In her agony, the girl had been pulling her own hair out while lying on her family's bodies in the cold hay. But the slaughter didn't end in the barn. The killer went back into the house. He walked down the hallway, past the locked doors. His boots left bloody prints on the clean floor. He entered Victoria's room, where 2-year-old Joseph was sleeping in his crib. The crib was covered in white lace. One precise strike punched through the lace in the child's thin skull. And finally, Maria, the maid who never even got to unpack. She heard the footsteps. She knew it wasn't the owner. She huddled in the corner of her room, clutching a crucifix. When the door burst open, she didn't beg for mercy. She just stared at the mattock, which was the last thing she ever saw. Sound, a deafening silence, only the sound of dripping water and the steady buzz of a fly. If you think the story ends here, you're wrong. The scariest part started after the last Gruber stopped breathing. The killer didn't run. He didn't hide in the woods. He went to the kitchen. He lit the stove. He made himself coffee using the beans Victoria had bought last week. He sat at the very table where the family had just had dinner, and he started to eat. For the next 3 days, Hinterkaifeck kept living. Neighbors saw smoke from the chimney. They saw lights in the windows. The mailman left papers on the porch, having no clue that behind the door, just feet away, a man was calmly reading yesterday's news, stepping over bloodstains. The killer fed the animals. He milked the cows so they wouldn't move and attract attention. He lived the Gruber's life, becoming the master of this bloody farm. Who was this man who could sleep in the beds of the people he'd just murdered? And why, when the farm was finally searched 4 days later, were no fingerprints found, even though the killer used all the dishes and tools? Was it even a man? Or had Hinterkaifeck always been waiting for a master like this? Imagine this. Your family is gone, lying cold in the barn, but the chimney is still smoking. The cows are being fed. Someone is sitting in your kitchen, drinking your coffee and sleeping in your bed, while your blood is still wet on the floor. For 4 days, a monster didn't just kill the Grubers, he replaced them. Chapter 5. The Ghost Host. It was Saturday, April 1st, 1922. A cold, gray morning broke over the Bavarian fields. To anyone passing by, the Hinterkaifeck farm looked perfectly normal. But if you looked closer, if you really leaned in, the silence was wrong. Sound, the wind whistling through the cracks of a wooden fence, the sound of heavy wet snow melting and dripping, drip, drip, drip. Usually at dawn, you'd hear old Andreas barking orders. You'd hear the children playing, the clatter of buckets. But that morning, there was only the low, steady hum of the diesel engine. Think about the psychology of a killer for a second. Most murderers strike and run. They want to put as many miles between them and the body as possible. But the shadow of Hinterkaifeck was different. He didn't run. He moved in. For the next 4 days, the killer became the master of the dead farm. Sound, the heavy creak of a rocking chair, the clink of a coffee cup being set down. Imagine him sitting there in the dark kitchen. The smell of the Last Supper, that thin, cold soup, is still in the air. He goes to the pantry. He finds the bread Victoria baked. He cuts a slice. Maybe he even spread some butter on it. He's calm. His heart rate hasn't even spiked. Andreas Gruber realized it. They weren't the masters of this house anymore. Someone else had taken control. Someone invisible, quiet, and very patient. It was that same primal fear the hikers at Dyatlov Pass must have felt before they cut open their tent and ran into the freezing night. But the Grubers had nowhere to run. They were trapped in their own fortress, and the fortress had become a cage. Andreas stepped out onto the porch to catch his breath, and that's when he saw it. The front door key was sticking out of the lock, the one that vanished 2 days ago. But the key was inserted from the inside. Someone had locked them in. Or were they inviting them to stay? Maria walked into this house at 5 p.m. 6 hours later, she'd be dead. She's the only maid in history whose first day on the job was officially the last day of her life. And the scariest part? She knew she was being watched before she even took off her coat. Chapter 3. The Last Supper. March 31st, 1922. Friday. Lead-colored clouds crawled across the Bavarian sky. The air was sticky and cold, a warning of the heavy rain that would soon turn the farm roads into an impassable mess. Maria Baumgartner adjusted the strap of her heavy bundle. At 44, she knew the value of hard work. Her sister, who walked her to the edge of the woods, waved for a long time, too scared to get any closer to the farm. Hinterkaifeck had a nasty reputation. Old Andreas was a cheapskate and a tyrant. Victoria was a widow with a heavy stare. And then there were those rumors about who actually fathered little Josef. But Maria needed the money. Sound, a gate creaking, wind whistling through bare branches. When she stepped into the kitchen, the first thing she noticed was the smell. It wasn't the smell of a cozy home. It smelled of stale sweat, sour milk, and something else. Attic dust. A single kerosene lamp flickered on the table. Its light shivered, catching the faces of the Gruber family. They sat so still that for a second, Maria thought she'd walked into a room full of wax figures. "You're late," Andreas rasped. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on a corner of the room where the shadow seemed thicker than usual. Victoria, his daughter, stood up to pour Maria a bowl of soup. It was thin and cold. The vibe in the house was something the sailors of the Mary Celeste would recognize. Everything in its place, everything working, but life was leaking out of the place like blood from a wound. Maria ate in dead silence. All she could hear was the clink of spoons and the steady tick of the clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. But through that rhythm, Maria caught another sound. From above, over the ceiling. Sound. 3 distinct muffled thuds on wood. She froze with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What was that?" she whispered. Old Cecilia didn't even flinch. Victoria lowered her head. Only Andreas clenched his jaw so hard you could hear his teeth grind. "Rats!" he snapped, but his eyes gave him away. It wasn't anger. It was the paralyzing animal fear of a man who knows that what's living in his attic isn't a rodent. It's something much bigger. Maria's gut was screaming, "Leave! Drop your stuff and run for the woods." But outside, it was pitch black, and the nearest village was miles of mud away. She told herself it was just an old house. Old houses make noise. After dinner, Victoria led her to a tiny maid's room. It smelled of mold and old hay. Maria made the bed, but didn't undress. She sat on the edge, listening. At Hinterkaifeck, silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was its own creature. It pressed against her ears. She heard the children settling in through the wall. She heard old Andreas locking the front door. And then she heard something she wasn't supposed to. A whisper, very close. Like someone was talking directly into the vent leading from the attic. Tonight, it reached her. Or did she just imagine it? Maria closed her eyes, trying to fall asleep, not knowing these were the last hours of her life. Meanwhile, in the attic, right above her, the man no one had seen for 3 days slowly lifted a heavy L-shaped mat. He wasn't in a hurry. He was savoring the moment. He was waiting for the house to fall into a trance. Chapter 4. Slaughter in the Barn. Sound. A diesel engine humming, then suddenly stopped. A ringing silence, a splash of liquid hitting wood. Late evening, around 10 p.m. Something lured the Grubers out of the house, something they heard in the barn. Maybe the killer slit the throat of a cow, or just started breaking equipment. Cecilia went first. An old woman with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. She walked through the narrow passage connecting the house to the barn. The air was thick with the smell of manure and cold metal oot steps on wood. Heavy breathing. Picture this: fresh snow and a trail of footprints. They lead straight from the dark woods to your front door. You look at them and realize there are no return tracks. Someone walked in, and that someone is watching you right now from the shadows of your attic. Chapter 1. One-way tracks. It's March 1922. A tiny farm called Hinterkaifeck, lost in the woods of Bavaria. If you looked at a map back then, it was just a dot, totally cut off from the world. Time felt different here. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay, cold manure, and old frozen stone. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old owner, wasn't a man who got scared easily. He was grumpy, tough, and he hated people. He definitely didn't believe in ghosts. That evening, he stepped out to check the latch on the barn. The wind was biting. It smelled like pine needles in the coming spring thaw. Andreas stopped. The frozen crust of the snow crunched under his boots. He looked down and froze. Sound. A sharp, tense violin screech, fading into a low hum. Footprints. Perfect imprints of a man's boots. They started right at the edge of the woods, crossed the snowy field, and stopped dead at the door of the farm's engine room. Andreas frowned. He walked along the tracks, expecting to find a second set, the ones leading back to the forest. But there was nothing. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted. His voice was raspy and got swallowed instantly by the thick trees. He searched the whole farm. He checked the barn, the locks on the house. Silence. Just the steady hum of the diesel generator and the heavy breathing of the cows in their stalls. But that feeling, that cursed feeling, often described by victims of missing 411 cases in U.S. national parks. The feeling that the forest had gone silent, like the birds had flown away and the predators were hiding, just watching you. Andreas went back inside. The house smelled of rendered fat and old wood. His wife, Cecilia, was sitting by the stove. She didn't ask what was wrong, but her eyes, cold and anxious, followed his every move. "Did someone come from the woods?" she finally asked. "Just a drifter." Andreas snapped, though his heart was pounding against his ribs. He couldn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the house, the floorboards creaking, mice in the walls, and something else. A distant, almost silent sound, like someone was very carefully trying to turn a doorknob. It reminds you of the devil's footprints in Devonshire, where tracks appeared on rooftops and locked yards. But that was a legend. Here at Hinterkaifeck, this was someone made of flesh and bone, and that someone was now living under the same roof as the Grubers. Chapter 2. The Symphony of the Invisible Guest. Sound, dripping water, the ticking of an old clock that slowly speeds up. 2 days passed. Paranoia started leaking through the walls of the farm like toxic gas. Andreas tried to stay rational, but the facts were staring him in the face. First, the keys went missing. An old heavy set for the main entrance. Andreas searched every corner, flipped every drawer. Nothing. Then, a few hours later, he found a newspaper on the porch. The Munich News. A fresh copy. The problem? The Grubers didn't subscribe to newspapers. The mailman hadn't been to the farm in a week because the roads were washed out. The paper was dry and smelled of fresh ink. Who brought it? And why? Sound. A dull thud on wood from above. Andreas's internal monologue was a non-stop argument. It's just a prank by the neighbors. They hate me. They want to scare me. But deep down, he knew the neighbors were too afraid of him to come near the farm at night. He thought back to his previous maid. She quit 6 months ago, packing her bags in 10 minutes. She was crying and crossing herself, claiming an invisible man lived in the attic and whispered her name through the vents. Back then, Andreas laughed at her. Now he wasn't laughing. One night, he woke up to a distinct sound. Creak. Pause. Creak. It was right above his head, in the attic. Andreas grabbed an old mattock, his only weapon, and lit an oil lamp. The lamp hummed, throwing long, twitching shadows on the walls. He climbed the narrow stairs. Every step sounded like a gunshot in his ears. He threw open the attic door. Empty. Just old junk, dusty sacks of grain, and a strange smell. It wasn't mold or old clothes. It was the smell of fresh tobacco and sweat. Human sweat. Andreas walked to the attic window. In the glass, he saw his own reflection. Pale face, sunken eyes. And behind him, deep in the attic, behind stacks of crates, he thought he saw one of the shadows move. He rushed over, throwing things aside, but no one was there. Just an open latch on the skylight, letting the freezing air rush in. The next morning, Cecilia found muddy boot prints in the kitchen, the same ones from the forest. But now, they led from the hallway, straight into their daughter Victoria's bedroom.